Nobody wants to consider that they're thinking about tariffs wrong, but most of us are. Are you? Grab your pearls early and lock in, because knowing what you're talking about could save you a huge headache when it comes to those pesky political and economic conversations. We're starting with why America's trade policy might be as watered down as your favorite chocolate bar from a nearby gas station. Unrelated pro tip, if it says chocolate candy, there's a good chance it's not actually chocolate. Now, the conventional wisdom goes something like this: slap a tariff on foreign goods and domestic production becomes more viable because imported stuff gets more expensive. Economics 101, right? But like most simple economic theories, this one's got more layers than tax dodging corporations' organizational chart. Want to understand why your Mexican Coca-Cola tastes better? You may already know. It's because it's made with real sugar. Well, why isn't all Coca-Cola made with real sugar in the U.S.? Welcome to the wild world of American sugar protectionism. The U.S. has some of the highest sugar prices in the world thanks to hefty tariffs on imported sugar. This policy is basically a perfect example of unintended consequences. We're going to set aside the fact that corn subsidies have turned high fructose corn syrup into the default sweetener from everything to sodas to bread in the U.S., and skip right to the additional layer of protectionism complexity here. Recent mergers have created what's essentially a monopoly, proving that sometimes protection from foreign competition just leads to domestic monopolies. Surprise! Still, tariffs have been historically super important to America. History has been very clear on this. Don't believe me? Well, let's look back on American history and take note of the massive shift in data prior to the 1970s versus after. In the early mid-1800s, tariffs were basically the government's ATM, ranging from 15 to 40%. The not-so-subtly named Tariff of Abominations hit in 1828, causing tariffs to rise to up to 45%. The Civil War era saw rates of 40 to 50%. The late 1800s saw the McKinley tariff pushing 48%. The Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930 topped out at 59%. And then post-World War II, from 1945 to 1970, average tariffs dropped to about 12% as GATT negotiations began. From the 1970s to 1980s, tariffs continued declining, averaging 5 to 7%. In the 1990s, the NAFTA implementation further reduced North American tariffs. In the 2000s, China joined the World Trade Organization, specifically in 2001, and U.S. average tariffs hit historic lows around 1.3 to 3%. But in 2018 to 2020, Trump-era China tariffs pushed some rates up to 25% on specific goods. In 2021 to 2024, many of Trump's tariffs remained, though average rates still were only around 3 to 4%. And then in 2025, a new round of trade actions demonstrated the fundamental problems with piecemeal policy. The initial 25% tariffs announced on Canada and Mexico quickly were suspended under national security negotiations. An additional 10% tariff implemented on Chinese imports, stacking on top of the existing 2018-era tariffs. Critical changes to the de minimis exemption targeting China, though with maddeningly inconsistent guidance about implementation requirements. And then contradictory CBP circulars about whether Chinese shipments require formal entry or just tariff payments. Here's what the impact is to the market currently. Apple projects a 3% hit to profits from Chinese tariffs. Amazon faces exposure on 25% of their products that are sourced from China. And Meta stands to lose billions in advertising revenue from companies like Temu and Shein.
Really want is love.
It's true.
Who represent 4% of Facebook's ad revenue and 2% of Instagram's. And you know what? Good. Let them take the hit. While your local toy store has to jump through high customs hoops to import a simple shipment of 50 toy cars for their shelves, these trillion-dollar giants have been exploiting loopholes to ship products one at a time, dodging both tariffs and customs procedures. It's the same old story of one set of rules for the mega corporations who can afford armies of lawyers and lobbyists, and another set for small business owners trying to keep their doors open. Maybe it's about time these companies learned what real competition feels like, instead of just winning by breaking a system that the rest of us have to follow. The irony is that we went from funding our entire government with tariffs in the 1800s to basically giving away free access to our markets while our trade partners maintained significant barriers to U.S. goods. The average U.S. tariff rate today is about 1/10 of what it was during America's peak industrial growth period. Makes you think, doesn't it? Now, government funding aside, I want to put this into perspective for you, and I've even been affected. Buying power. Yeah, it's related. In 1900, the average worker made about $438 per year. That's about $15,000 in today's money. But here's the thing. A decent suit cost $10, about $340 today. And a pound of butter was 26 cents. That's about $9 today. Wages were lower, but stuff was proportionately cheaper because, surprise, the dollar actually meant something. Meanwhile, the U.S. was playing musical chairs with its monetary system. It started as a bimetallic standard, both gold and silver, at 16-1. Then we moved to the gold standard in 1900, which was about $20.67 per ounce. Then in 1913 came along the which basically fucked everything up. Created a secret meeting in Jekyll Island by a bunch of bankers who basically wrote themselves a blank check to control America's money supply. In 1971, after decades of money printing that would make a counterfeiter blush, we had to abandon the gold standard entirely because foreign countries figured out that we were debasing our currency and started demanding actual gold instead of our increasingly worthless promises. Gold promptly shot up over $2,000 an ounce because turns out when you print money like it's going out of style, people prefer something that's actually scarce. Interest rates during these periods bounced around like a rubber ball. In the early 1800s, 6 to 8% was typical, and then panic times could see rates spike between 15 and 20%. Post-Fed, we got the Great Depression. Nice work, guys. Then came the inflation of the 1970s, forcing rates up to 20% to stop the bleeding from all the money printing. Now we're stuck in the cycle of artificial booms and busts, with the Fed constantly trying to fix problems that they created in the first place. See, when we killed the gold standard, we also killed real pricing power. Think about it. Back when the dollar was actually worth something specific, like, an actual unit of gold, the Fed couldn't just conjure trillions out of thin air. Because of that, the money supply stayed relatively static, and coincidentally, there weren't more dollars chasing the same amount of goods. There was the same amount of dollars chasing the same amount of goods. However, since we no longer have actual backing for the money we print all willy-nilly, we're now stuck in this weird paradox. Prices keep going up, but actual purchasing power keeps going down. Sure, wages were higher than ever in nominal terms, but so is everything else. It's like being on a treadmill where you have to run faster and faster just to stay in the same place. Consider this. Back when we had sound money, we also had serious tariffs and actual antitrust enforcement. It's almost like they all work together or something. When the dollar meant something and monopolies got broken up instead of bailed out, American workers could actually afford American-made goods. Imagine that. We had a system where wages were meaningful, and if you got too big for your britches, Teddy Roosevelt would show up with his trust-busting stick. But somehow we convinced ourselves that efficient markets meant letting giant corporations do whatever the fuck they want while pretending that cheap foreign goods would make up for the stagnant wages. Spoiler alert. It didn't work out that way. That's why a discussion about just tariffs is like bringing a water pistol to a trade war. Currently, tariffs are just high enough to make the companies complain, but too low to actually change their behavior. When a company can still save more money manufacturing overseas, even after paying tariffs, guess what they're going to do? Hint, it's not opening factories in Ohio. Think about it. A U.S. worker costs more not just because of wages, but because we actually have crazy ideas like workplace safety and environmental regulations. When a Chinese factory can dump toxic waste into the nearest river while their American competitor has to spend millions on EPA compliance, that's not exactly a level playing field. Don't even get me started on things like workers' comp insurance or OSHA requirements. But here's where most politicians get it wrong. They look at the situation and think, all right, let's slap a flat 25% tariff on everything from China, as if somehow that magically evens things out. Some industries have massive cost differences due to regulations and labor standards, while others are mostly automated anyways. A one-size-fits-all tariff is about as sophisticated as fixing a Swiss watch with a sledgehammer. So what's the alternative? Well, what if we actually did the math? What if we based tariffs on the actual cost difference between manufacturing in different countries? Here's the math. A worker in China makes, let's say, X dollars less per hour, and they get Y dollars less in benefits. And then it takes Z hours to make the product. Well, a tariff is parenthesis X plus Y parenthesis times Z. Boom. It's so simple you could calculate it on Excel in 20 minutes or less. But apparently this is too straightforward for the rich douchebags in power who can't remember what a gallon of milk costs. The disconnection is prices don't actually matter. What matters is purchasing power. BlackRock doesn't care if a house costs $1 million because they've got the purchasing power to buy entire neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the rest of us are arguing about whether a 10% price increase on imported goods will hurt consumers. One of my bosses once said, if it costs too much to do it right, then make more money. While that might sound like peak corporate arrogance, it actually hints at a deeper truth. We're too focused on keeping prices low instead of increasing purchasing power for the average person. Of course, there's an elephant in the room. American companies are increasingly monopolistic. When you've got no real competition, you can pass on whatever you want to consumers. This complicates any discussion of tariffs because without true market competition, companies don't have to respond to market pressures in the way economic theory suggests they would. And let's be real, this is exactly what happens every time anyone proposes higher tariffs. The same companies that somehow manage to absorb fluctuating commodity prices, currency exchange rates, and shipping costs without blinking suddenly claim that a 10% tariff will bankrupt them and destroy the American consumer. Really? Walmart can handle a 30% swing in container shipping rates without raising prices, but a tariff is somehow different? The truth is, they pass on the cost because they can. When 5 companies control 80% of the given market, they don't have to worry about being undercut by competition. They just have to make sure that they all raise prices together, which, mysteriously, they seem to manage without actually colluding. Wink, wink. It's not just price fixing if you happen to match your competitors' price increases, right? This is why any serious discussion of tariff policy has to address monopoly power first. Otherwise, we're just giving massive corporations another excuse to squeeze consumers while maintaining their profit margins. For example, the same companies that threaten to pass on every cent of tariff increases to consumers somehow never pass on the savings when tariffs decrease. Funny how that works. As of early 2025, we're watching the predictable outcome of using tariffs as a blunt instrument without addressing underlying structural issues. The administration's approach of using national security justifications to patch trade problems creates policy that are both legally tenuous and practically ineffective. What about this for a nice example of the failure? While a low-cost t-shirt might absorb a tariff increase, requiring formal customs entry would fundamentally change the economics of direct-to-consumer shipping from China. Yet, by targeting only Chinese shipments while leaving the other channels open, like shipping the items to Mexico or Canada, where the items can then be reshipped, the policy creates obvious workarounds. And we don't have to go into the additional issue of enforcement capacity since we're talking about these rules affecting millions of packages per day. The responses from other countries have ranged from predictable, like retaliatory tariffs, to downright creative, like Ontario boycotting American alcohol. While markets predictably freaked out and analysts warned of inflation, the real question isn't whether prices will go up, because they probably will, but whether these tariffs are high enough to actually change corporate behavior and create better paying jobs here at home. Look, we need much higher tariffs, particularly on critical goods like medical devices and technology. Yes, this will likely increase prices in the short term, but if it leads to more domestic manufacturing jobs with good wages and benefits, who cares if an iPhone costs more? Remember, purchasing power or price. The goal shouldn't be to have the cheapest possible goods made by the lowest paid workers. The goal should be to have a robust domestic manufacturing sector that provides good jobs with benefits, even if it means paying more for some products. After all, what good is cheap stuff if nobody can afford to buy it anyways? Let's be honest. America has a long, ugly tradition of building wealth by exploiting cheap labor. We've just gotten more sophisticated about keeping the suffering at arm's length, using things like supply chains and container vessels. The exploitation hasn't ended, we've just moved it offshore where it's easier to ignore. And the worst part? We pretend this is all in service of low prices for American consumers, as if there's something noble about getting cheap t-shirts made by workers that are locked in factories, or electronics assembled by people working 16-hour shifts. We have essentially outsourced our conscience along with our manufacturing, telling ourselves that whatever happens in those distant factories isn't our problem, even as we profit from it. The current approach to tariffs is like using a band-aid to fix a broken arm. We need tariffs actually high enough to change corporate behavior, not just high enough to make them grumble at shareholder meeting. Remember, prices are just numbers. Purchasing power is what matters. Maybe it's time we stopped worrying about keeping prices low and started focusing on making sure people can afford to buy things, even if they cost more. Yes, this requires dealing with the monopoly problem too, but nobody said fixing decades of misguided trade policy would be easy. Let us know in the comments how you would fix it.